Okay, so good day, everyone. So I am Vincent, and I'm your host for this interview. With me to join this discussion are Brother Maki Villasis and Brother Jerry Famoso. And I'm thrilled to welcome our distinguished guest from UK. But before we begin, let me introduce first the topic of this discussion. We are going to answer the question, is God still relevant today? Or how is God relevant in the 21st century? Today, we are thrilled by the progress of modern science because it changed the way we understand ourselves and the natural world. It challenged the way we understand common sense and truth. One example of this is quantum mechanics, which is counterintuitive. It is contrary to the way we experience reality. Science has answered almost all the questions religious asked for millennia. The territories that were once held by religion are now usurped by science. So, with this, we can ask the following questions. What space should science leave to religion? Are God questions still relevant today? Or is God still relevant in the 21st century? With us to discuss and try to answer these questions is Professor Alister McGrath. Professor Alister McGrath is Andreas Idros Professor of Science and Religion and a Fellow of Harris Manchester College at the University of Oxford. He was the president of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Professor McGrath holds three doctorates, a doctoral degree in molecular biophysics, a Doctor of Divinity degree in theology, and a Doctor of Letters degree in intellectual history, all from the University of Oxford. He is author of many books, including Darwinism and the Divine, Evolutionary Thought and Natural Theology, Understanding the Trinity, Darwinism and the Divine, Evolutionary Thought and Natural Theology, and the Dawkins Delusion. So, brothers and sisters, let us welcome Professor Alister McGrath.
Well, thank you. It's very good to be with you.
Okay, so good day, Professor Alister McGrath. So, before we discuss those questions that I mentioned, let's start first with you. I mean, you started as an atheist, no, before you become a Christian. So, I mean, how did you discover Christianity, Professor?
Well, I was an atheist, and I think I was an atheist because I was a scientist, and I was studying science at high school, and felt that science and religion were incompatible. In other words, if you loved science, you couldn't be a religious person. And then I went up to Oxford University to study chemistry and met some very intelligent and very articulate Christians. And that I think really helped me to realize that it was not as simple as I had thought, that in effect, there were ways of understanding the relationship of science and faith, which I hadn't understood before. And also, I think I began to understand for the first time what Christianity was all about. I had, I think, misunderstood what Christianity was, and being able to see that Christianity was not simply accepting certain ideas as being true, but rather a new way of living, a new way of thinking, a transformative way of thinking was very, very exciting for me. So, if you like, when I was 18, I had this radical change in the way in which I thought about things, which involved embracing Christianity. And of course, that meant rethinking my relationship between faith and science.
Yes. So, how did it change your life, Professor? I mean, the Christian perspective, Professor.
I think the Christian perspective changed my life in a number of ways. One was it gave me a framework to understand myself and the world, but also I think gave me a sense of hope. You know, I'm here for a reason, that I matter, I'm significant, that it really began to answer some deep existential questions. Whereas I tend to think of science as simply answering functional questions. How do things work? How do we control our world? But I didn't really find science answering deeper questions like what is the meaning of life? What is the good? How do we live a good life? And so, if you like, one of the things I began to realize was that science was very, very helpful in some ways, but there were many questions it did not answer and could not answer. And that, I think, made me realize I needed more than science to have a full understanding of myself and the world.
Yes, and I think that's a good segue, Professor. So this time we're going to talk about the questions that theology can answer and the questions that only science can answer. And I think, Brother Maki, could you start the conversation?
You said something about, having a framework by which you understand yourself and the world. Would you say that that's a competing framework to a purely scientific understanding of the world, some sort of scientism where it somehow is the only way to truth? And where do they coincide, this Christian, particularly Christian worldview, and also a scientific worldview, and how do they overlap?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. And certainly when I was an atheist, I thought, science answers all of our questions and there is no need for any other way of approaching life. And therefore, any other worldview is simply wrong because it cannot answer questions in a scientific way. What I would now say is this: there is a spectrum of human knowledge. And science is a very important part of that spectrum, but it's only part. In other words, science is very good at answering some questions, but there are many questions it cannot answer. For example, what is good? What is meaning? These are questions that science can't really answer. So one way of beginning to think about the relationship of science and faith is to say that science is very, very good at answering questions about the functioning of our world. How does our world work? How do we understand, for example, the way in which the moon orbits the Earth? That's a very good scientific question. But there are other questions like, how should I behave? What is the meaning of life? And these are important to all of us. And science can't answer them, but they are good questions and we need to be able to answer them. And that means that, if you like, there are some questions that science is able to answer, and that's great, but there are questions it can't answer. And happily, Christianity is able to give us very good, very powerful, very reassuring answers to those questions. So if you like, it's a bit like, well, putting on a pair of spectacles. I have two lenses, one scientific, one is Christian, and together they give me stereoscopic vision. I can see things in depth, not simply, a surface reading of things, but rather something that's deeper and richer.
Just a follow up. But what do you say to people, for instance, who think of religion as believing in a God of the gaps, of only those gaps that science cannot answer, but somehow these gaps are getting smaller and smaller, especially in terms of our functional and technical knowledge about the world? What do you say about that? Because in my opinion, that's something a bit impoverished. It reduces Christianity to technical and functional knowledge instead of being a framework that holistically explains what it is, who we are, and what our world is all about.
Thank you. Again, that's a very good question. I enjoy reading C.S. Lewis, and he talks about this question. One of the points he makes is that Christianity gives us this vision of reality, this way of seeing things, which helps us understand why science works and what its limits are. I think that's a very important point to make. I'm not a Christian because I'm looking for God in gaps. I'm looking for a big picture which makes sense of everything, including why science works, but what its limits are. So therefore, for me, my Christian faith enables me to understand why science works, and I'm very, very pleased about that. But it also helps me to realize that science can't answer all the questions. So if you like, what I'm saying is that Christianity helps us to value science while at the same time recognize its limits. And it's not about looking around for gaps and saying that's where God lives. It's much more, God gives us this vision of reality, which helps us to understand ourselves and our worlds, and also helps to understand what science can do and also what it can't do. So if you like, it's about a big picture of reality. And to me, that's very important.
Yes. So thank you, Professor. Brother Jerry, do you have questions?
None for now, brother.
Okay, sige. So let's proceed with with that line of discussion, Professor, I think it's very important also to ask if uh, how do we approach these two types of question? I mean, scientific, I mean, there's a scientific method and theological questions. I mean, how do we approach those questions, Professor, that pertain uh, to God, for example? Is there a holistic approach to that, or there is a parang one size fits all approach to answering theological questions?
Well, I think there are several ways of answering theological questions, and each of us develops our own way, which reflects the way we understand our faith and also the people we are talking to. So when talking to scientists, it's very important for me to have been a scientist, to in fact understand how science works, but also I'm very much aware that scientists are human beings who are asking big questions like everybody else. Like, for example, what is the meaning of life? Why am I here? What am I meant to be doing? And very often the scientists I talk to will say, well, look, our science does not answer those questions,
Yes.
but we need answers. So I think it's very important to emphasize the ability of the Christian faith to give you this framework, which helps you to answer those questions. So how might we answer those? Well, I think what we need to do is find Christian writers who in effect think it's important to engage these questions and give us ways of answering them. So in my own case, that there are several local Oxford writers who are very, very good at answering these questions. I've mentioned C.S. Lewis, but I certainly found many of my fellow Oxford scientists good at giving me ways of thinking about these questions. I think one of the things we need to do is to kind of explore our faith and help us work out how it's able to answer some of these questions. So I could give some examples, but I think it's just very important to read Christian writers who are going to help you think about these things, because that will be very helpful. So, for example, one writer I find very helpful is a writer called John Polkinghorne. Again, Polkinghorne, who was a Cambridge quantum theorist who became a theologian. And he writes very, very well on this question of the relationship of science and faith in general, but also the question about, for example, quantum theory and how we understand life, which is something you mentioned earlier in our conversation.
Yes. So with that, Professor, let's try to answer some theological questions that bedevil our people today. For example, we experienced the pandemic. So one common question maybe is, where is God in all this? I mean, there are people who are actually dying, and this pandemic is actually parang killing us all. So I mean, where can we find God in all this?
I think what we need to say is that the COVID pandemic is, in effect, the result of natural forces. That, in effect, what caused the pandemic is a purely natural phenomenon called a virus. But it became much, much worse than it could have been because of the way in which we behave as human beings. For example, international air travel meant it's much easier for the virus to spread from one population to another. Sometimes there are social conditions, which means that the virus has a much bigger impact than might otherwise have. I think one of the points we need to emphasize is that, if I can put it like this, the virus is not something that's evil, it's just something that's natural. And it's had this impact on us. I think that's a very important point to make. And I think one of the things I've learned from the COVID outbreak is that human beings are much more fragile, much weaker, much more vulnerable than we thought we were. I think, very often when I would talk to my scientist friends in the past, they would say, of course, science is helping us to overcome everything. But I think the virus outbreak has brought home to us that actually we are much weaker, much more vulnerable than we thought we were. And that actually is saying something very important about human nature. I think that is something that's important that we need to say. So for me, God is there in the virus outbreak. He's there in the way in which we care for each other. He's there in the way in which we try to help each other deal with these things. But it's much more complex than that. It's bringing home to us that we as human beings are vulnerable, we're mortal, and we need help if we're going to be able to cope with all these challenges that life is throwing at us. So for me, the COVID pandemic has brought home how vulnerable we are and how we need help if we're going to be able to cope with this world.
Yes, and how do you respond, Professor, to the accusation or the problem posed by atheist philosophers? I mean, for example, Peter Singer, he would say that uh, he cannot imagine a benevolent God to create a very fragile world. It is too benevolent. I mean, why create a universe or a creation that is too fragile, or I mean, something like that?
Well, I think the difficulty for philosophers like Peter Singer is this. We look at our world and we say, surely there can be a better world than this.
Yes.
But where do we get the idea from? Because we have nothing we can compare this world to be able to say there is a better world. I mean, for example, I could, look at a building and say that's not been very well built. I've seen better buildings, so I know that better buildings can be produced. But with the world, we only have this world. There's no way we can say that there has to be a better world than this. And that, I think, is a very important point. There is no comparison. We can't make a comparison with something else. And if you like, what Peter Singer is doing is simply say, I have this deep intuition there has to be a better world than this. But where does that come from? There's no scientific evidence for that. I think that from a Christian perspective, there's a very strong sense that we see this world in the light of the hope of the New Jerusalem. And that means that we realize that this world is not everything it could be, that it is weak, it's fallen, and we live in hope of one day being in a better place. But that motivates us to try and make this world a better place because we have a sense of that God is calling us to try and do something to make this world better. But it's not about saying that God could have made a better world because there's no empirical basis for saying that. I think that's a very important point to make in this discussion.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor. Okay, so Brother Jerry.
Professor, we have talked about the evils that one can see in society, especially in this in this pandemic. So it somehow gives an impression to people that God doesn't exist because this evil exists. So because of that, maybe the rate of secularism and atheism is increasing. So aside from being a professor, you're also a Christian apologist, Professor McGrath. So I'd like to ask, we have mentioned a lot about Lewis while earlier. So how has Lewis impacted your way of doing apologetics, his way of dialoguing with the secular world, the way he talks to people of other faiths or to those who have no faith at all? That's it.
I think Lewis is a very good apologist. And one of the things I like about C.S. Lewis is that he gives us a way of connecting the Christian faith up with other people's lives by helping us to see that it makes sense of their lives. It speaks to their experience. It's not simply about abstract rational arguments. It's about here is something that engages with the way in which we experience reality. If you like, it connects up with us at a deep level. I think one of the points that Lewis makes very, very clearly is that Christianity is able to satisfy the deepest desires of the human heart. Because many people feel that they are looking for something that is really significant, something that will bring meaning and value, but they're also aware that they have not yet found that. And one of the points that Lewis is making is that Christianity is able to satisfy our deepest longing. It's all about, if you like, the heart's desire. And there are many people, including many scientists, who know that there's something missing from their lives. And they find in Christianity something that brings them peace, satisfaction, well-being. I think that's a very important point to make, because very often we present Christianity as if it's simply a way of thinking. And Lewis reminds us that something much deeper than that. It's something that connects up with the human heart and not simply the human mind. And that's very important because sometimes we present Christian apologetics as if it's simply a debate about, which is the better way of looking at our world. It's much more than that. It's about what way of understanding things actually makes sense of us and our world, but also gives us hope and meaning and significance in what very often seems to be a very fragile and dangerous world. And that's important because the COVID pandemic has brought home to us that we are fragile. And it's asked, where then can we find our strength? And so it's this idea of being able to trust in God as the one who gives us strength as we try to cope with these very difficult situations. And that, I think, is an important point to make.
And Professor, in line with that, you have said that most scientists, excuse me, most scientists find something, that there's something missing in their lives. So and they found it in Christianity. But will it be possible that these scientists can also find meaning in other faiths, Islam, Judaism, and other religions?
I think that most worldviews, most ways of thinking do give you an understanding of what meaning is. So certainly, for example, atheism would say there is no meaning except what we invent. So you are free to choose what you like. And Islam, Buddhism, Judaism give you various understandings of meaning. For me, Christianity gives you this very rich understanding of meaning, which is very, very important. I think a point to emphasize here is that to say that different religions offer meaning does not mean they're all the same or that they're all right. It's rather saying this is one of the things that religion does. It gives you a system of meaning. You then have to make the judgment, which of these is the best, which is the most reliable, which is the one that makes the most difference. And that, again, is why I enjoy reading people like C.S. Lewis, because one of the points he makes is that Christianity is not simply, about saying, here are some ideas that change you, but rather, here is a living person who is able to transform your life. It's all about a relationship with Christ. And that, I think, is a very important point to make, because it's not simply about an abstract way of thinking. It's a relationship. It's something which actually enables you to relate to God. And that's why I think so many people find Christianity so powerful at this point.
Any follow-up question, Brother Jerry?
Thank you for the answers, Professor.
Thank you.
Brother
Yeah,
Mark?
I think I also have a sort of a comment. I was really struck by the way you mentioned that Christianity allows us this vision of reality, because if I remember correctly, it was one of the talks of Jean-Luc Marion, who says that somehow this narrower use of reason, this technical scientific thinking, the more we are successful in doing that, the more we are disappointed, because it doesn't really answer everything. And secondly, because that's not how we think most of the time. We don't really think in a vacuum, just think rationally, but it involves the entirety of our being. And so the broader use of reason, what he calls the broader use of reason, involves a certain sort of faith and a certain sort of involving the entirety of our being, which actually answers the more important questions in life. I also somehow am reminded of Joseph Ratzinger, who talks about belief, believing as a fundamental option towards reality, or fundamental attitude towards reality. It's not just answering this or that as if though they were functional questions. It's really looking at reality, and not just looking, but actually involving a relationship, giving or handing oneself over to something or someone that makes meaning of my life and all the other lives. So it's not just, as you said, it's not just the use of the intellect. It's not just the answers to intellectual questions or questions about propositions, but more importantly, of more holistic and broader use of our reason, that faith itself is reasonable, not because it answers logically everything that we want to ask about the world, but because it, as Lewis says, makes shines on, I forget the actual quote, but it shines on everything else like the sun. It makes sense of what we of our own realities and our own existential questions about our lives.
I think that's right. I think that's very important. And you're right. Lewis has this wonderful quote. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And you're right about reason. I mean, scientific reason very often is instrumental. Here's a way of engaging or manipulating the world, but it doesn't deal with the deep human questions, which are really important. I remember when Ratzinger addressed the World Youth Conference, he did say that one of the biggest questions is, what is life about and who do we trust? Who do we trust? That's a very important point because he's emphasizing that relationality is very, very important in human existence. It's not just what we think, it's the people who we trust, who we travel with, and who we learn from. And that's why the idea of God as a shepherd who journeys wherever we go and is always with us is so important, because that's what we need as human beings, relationships, including this powerful and transformative relationship with God. So I think that's a very important point you made.
Okay. Yes, Brother Jerry.
Also a question, Professor. It's related to Brother Mackey's. We have mentioned about Joseph Ratzinger, and I remember reading his book. He distinguishes these two terms, intellectus and ratio, where the intellectus is more concerned on the deeper strata of being, as what Brother Mackey has said, more holistic, while ratio is more concerned of the empirical. It's colder. It's more it doesn't have in a sense no heart. So in this world which is more concerned on results rather than the process, are we going in a way which is more concerned of on ratio, on empirical, which is more results based? That are we going to that path? And if we are going to that path, is that a bad thing?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think if I could rephrase it slightly, because you've made a very good point, but we could also make a distinction between knowledge and wisdom, knowledge and wisdom. And one of the problems really is that in modern Western culture, and I'm sure you experience this in the Philippines, there's this huge emphasis on knowledge as information. But very often we don't seem to be able to see what the big picture is, how everything is joined up and interconnected. In other words, we very often focus simply on narrow aspects of reality and can't see how we fit into this. There's a very famous quote from the American sociobiologist Edward Wilson. He said, "We are drowning in information, but we are starved of wisdom." In other words, we just don't have the right kind of knowledge, because the kind of knowledge that really matters is more than just empirical information. It's about a way of putting everything together so we can make sense of life and live meaningfully. I think that is very important because Christianity does talk a lot about wisdom, the importance of seeing this bigger picture, of understanding how we fit into this world, and also just realizing that we need more than simply factual information. We need to understand who we are and what we are meant to be doing. And one of my concerns is that modern science and technology is really providing us simply with empirical information. And that's useful, but we need so much more than that. And that's why I think we need to show people that Christianity gives us this way of joining these things up, of seeing the bigger picture that lies behind these. I think that's a very important point to make in conversation with people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So this time we're going to talk about the status of theology today. So what do you think is the status of theology today, Professor Martin, especially there in Oxford?
Well, I think there are two audiences we might ask. One is in the academic world in general, what's the status of theology? And the answer is it would be controversial for some people because they would say, you're asking us to talk about God. Can you prove there is a God? Yeah. And so you can see why debates would arise. But I think most people would say that the strength of theology is that for a very long period, thousands of years, theology has been engaging these really deep questions and they need answers. So I think that's an important thing about the academic world in general. But then we have the world of the church. And in the church, very often you'll find many lay people will say, well, look, I don't see what the point of theology is. It makes my faith more difficult. It uses all these complicated terms. I don't see what theology adds to the life of faith. I think that's a very important point to make because one of the things that that pastors, priests, and academics need to do is to show that theology is able to bring a new depth and a new richness to the life of faith. And that, I think, is important. It's about understanding your faith better. It's about being able to join things together better. But it's also about helping each of us to construct a personal vision of who we are and the difference that we can make. So for me, theology, I think, is very important to the life of the church, because if you like, theology sustains the vision that lies at the heart of the Christian faith. It's saying we need to preserve and protect this idea of a glorious God who we worship and make sure that we never lose sight of that. So theology may use complex language, but it's trying to say, let's keep this vision alive, because this is what gives Christianity its distinct identity and keeps it going in today's world.
Brother Maki, Brother Jeremy, you have questions?
I think that's a really important point you made regarding how theology can contribute to the lives of ordinary people, especially, for instance, in the Philippines. Hopefully, when we become priests, when we are ordained and we minister to people, sometimes the thing is, theology set aside for pastoral work. But as you said, it's important to have depth in terms of our believing. Not that we need to be academic, but really to add depth to what we do as pastors, and also to the challenge to really somehow package it, or for lack of a better term, so that people may understand it more, understand their faith more, and appreciate it. And I think the important thing there is the making Christianity, making our faith attractive to people. What I think Balthasar says something about beauty, attracting us, drawing us up to it. So that's how I think theology can help us. I mean, it's really difficult. It's really an everyday struggle, especially in my part. But I think it's one of the challenges that I'm happy to face. It's something that's I think worthwhile to pursue, not just in an academic setting, but really in the pastoral setting in the future.
I think that's right. And I think if I can put it like this, if you're a priest, you play a very important role because you are interpreting the Christian faith to your congregations and saying, here is the difference it can make. Here is how this can help you. And you're the person who knows your congregation, you know your Christian faith, and you can make the connections between faith and your people and help them to see the difference this makes. So if you like, you're an interpreter, you're a figure of wisdom who's going to help the people you're ministering to understand how their faith changes their lives, and you can model this for yourself. So it's a very, very important role, I think, and one that it's really very, very valuable.
Yeah.
And just to add, I think I again remember another thing from Balthasar, who says that theology should be a theology on one's knees. So it's not really, again, like we said earlier, it's not just academic, intellectual, an intellectual pursuit per se, but something that involves a relationship. So it somehow should not be, I think, disconnected from our own relationship and our own faith life.
No, I agree. You're absolutely right. I mean, theology at its best leads to worship, adoration, and prayer because it gives you this vision of God, which makes you want to worship. I think that's very important because, as we were saying earlier, very often you think of theology simply in terms of understanding. Well, it is that, but it's much more than that. It's about being given this vision of God, which makes you want to worship God and gives you something to live for.
So thank you. And to follow up, Professor, what do you think are the questions that theology should be asking today? I mean, do we still stick to those questions that were raised before by the church fathers, or do we have another set of questions that we really need to ask, especially in the 21st century?
I think there are some perennial questions. The questions are always there. What difference does God make to my life? That's a very important question. And Christians have been thinking about that for 2,000 years.
Yes.
Or, you might think of, for example, how does believing in God enable me to lead a better life? Now, we need to be able to answer those questions. And sometimes we give those answers by quoting theologians, but more often we'd say, here's how I do this. Here's how I think about this. Because as I was saying to a colleague a moment ago, you are in a position to say, here is how I make sense of this. This may help you as well. But there are some new questions. And one thing we've been talking about, which is whether the rise of a scientific culture, in effect, is bad news for religion. Well, the answer is it's ambiguous. It could be either. It raises challenges for faith, but the key point here is that the movement that we call the New Atheism with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, which became very influential about 15 years ago, and all about science has all the answers to life. Well, that movement has disappeared because it didn't have its own answers at all. And people began to realize that it was simply being critical of religion with no alternative vision to answer. So I think that is important. But I think, again, this is why it's so important for individual priests, individual pastors, to, in effect, say, I can see this question being asked. I wonder if I could help answer this on the basis of my knowledge of the Christian faith. In other words, just saying that each of us has to try and answer some of these questions as they are raised by our culture and see if we can give good answers. And one of the points I want to make, and again, this is a point made by C.S. Lewis, is that one of the things we have to show is that Christianity gives better answers to some of life's big questions than secularism or science. We can do that, but I think we need to practice that and show that there's a very rich resource here which we can interpret and explain.
Brother Maki, you have questions?
Yeah, just a thought. You said that somehow it also is personal. No? You try to show people that this is how personally I appropriate what Christianity is about, and that's how I can share this to you. This might be a bit personal, but in I guess in your story of conversion and everything, were there people who were like that exerted somehow their personal influence over you and helped you understand and better, I guess, live out your Christianity?
Yes, there were many. I could name some of them, but here's the point I want to make. Very often in talking to my Christian friends, they would answer a specific question, not everything, but they would say, here's how I make sense of this, or here's how I deal with this issue. And they wouldn't answer my question completely, but they did two things. First of all, they showed me there was an answer. And secondly, they helped me begin to think about this. And that's very important because I think very often we feel we have to be able to give definitive, exhaustive, comprehensive answers. Whereas very often what people are looking for is reassurance that there is an answer and help in beginning to find it. So if you say, look, I found this helpful, it's this. For example, some of the things you said to me have been very interesting and very helpful. And we know that that's what people want. They want to be helped to find these answers. And so giving them the beginnings of an answer will keep them going. I think very often people are suspicious of very simplistic answers. Again, that's one of the reasons why people have moved away from the new atheism, Richard Dawkins and others, because it's simplistic. It just doesn't take things seriously. So I think what we need to try and help people see is something very deep and very rich about Christianity, which is difficult to put into words. But nevertheless, when you grasp it, it's transformative, it's satisfying, it's wonderful.
Brother Maki?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, very important point, at least for me personally. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And Professor, I think I've included this in my email. I would like to ask you about analytic theology. I think this is something new in theology. So what can you say about analytic theology? And do you think it will achieve its goals, Professor?
I think analytic theology has real potential, and certainly some of my colleagues here at Oxford take it very, very seriously. I think one thing it's trying to do is to help us understand how Christianity uses words, how they're connected, and that is very, very important. I do have one concern, and that is that we need to understand how Christianity developed its ideas. In other words, it didn't just say, hey, we have this idea of the incarnation. It in effect developed the idea of the incarnation to make sense of what it found in the New Testament and what it found in the Christian way of living. So we need to be aware that in effect, there's a process of thinking that brought about these ideas. And I think that's one of the things analytical theology is not quite so good at doing. Analytic theology tends to say, here's what Christianity talks about. Let's look at the words. My point would be, we need to look at how those words emerge, like Trinity, like incarnation, because that helps us understand things better. But I think analytical theology has a future.
And I don't know, Professor, if you encountered J.C. Beale. He's from the Notre Dame University, and he said that if we're going to look at Christ and the metaphysics of incarnation, he said that Christ is a contradictory being. So, do you agree with that?
What I would say is that we live in a situation where, and this goes back to your point about quantum theory at the beginning of our conversation. From a human perspective, very often we see things as being contradictory.
Yes.
Then you realize that when you see them from a particular perspective, they aren't contradictory. They naturally belong together. And that's why I think ideas like the incarnation are very important, because from a human perspective, it seems to be a tension, a contradiction. But when you see them in the perspective of the Christian faith, actually, it makes sense that works. And it's a question of finding the right framework to make sense of these.
Yes, yes. Brother Jerry, you have questions?
Professor, I'm going to ask about the rising, we have talked about analytic theology, which is relatively new. So are there some sort of things, techniques of doing theology that we should be wary about, or should we stick to what we have, what have worked for years, for the longest time? Like I'm remembering the document Eterni Patris, where the restoration of Christian philosophy in Christian schools in the light of Thomas Aquinas, scholastic philosophy. So should we stick to that for, well, in our case, in a Catholic institution, or should we explore? And if we should explore, what are the things that we should be wary about?
I think, let me put it like this. I think that you need a solid foundation from which to engage the questions that you're being asked in the church and in the world. And certainly Thomas Aquinas provides you with that. So do other theologians. But the key point is that we need a solid base of knowledge and understanding to be able to engage with new questions as and when they arise. And I think one of my concerns is that sometimes people think, well, we don't need this solid base of knowledge. We simply need to be quick and able to answer new questions. But what I want to say to you is that a deep familiarity with the richness of the Christian tradition is really important in engaging new questions. And that, again, is one of the reasons why I like C.S. Lewis. He keeps emphasizing, that of course there are new questions, but we need to be firmly rooted in the tradition to be able to answer these new questions. And I find that very, very interesting in dealing with the questions of science and faith. Because what I've noticed is that some of the best answers given to the questions arising from science are from people who are deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. So I think what we need to do is to be able to root ourselves in a deep understanding of the Christian faith, and then be able to use that to engage new challenges, new questions, as and when they arise.
Any follow-up question?
Thank you for the answer, Professor.
Brother Maki?
Yeah, maybe that's like a bit again a bit maybe not just I guess personal, but it might help our viewers when we post this. You've mentioned C.S. Lewis a lot of times. Maybe some of us are familiar with his more literary works, such as the Chronicles of Narnia. But where can we begin, as students of theology, as people wanting to know more or reflect more on our faith? Where can we begin with the works of C.S. Lewis to be able to help us?
I think there are two works of his that are really worth looking at. And they were both written about the same time in the 1950s. One of them is Surprised by Joy, which is his spiritual autobiography, how he discovered faith. And the other is Mere Christianity, which is in effect about the questions people ask about faith and answers he gives. And Lewis, I think, writes very, very well. And he also writes from a consensual Christian perspective. In other words, he's not saying, I'm going to talk to you about Catholicism or Protestantism or anything like that. So I'm just going to talk to you about Christianity. And that actually gives him a very wide appeal. So those two books are worth reading. And what I suggest you do is see them as helping you to answer people's questions, because the answers Lewis gives are good, but you can make them even better by making sure that they relate to your congregation, to your people. So Lewis is great for that. He, if you like, gives us resources that we can take and use.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, this is just a personal sharing, but somehow the British Christian tradition has helped me immensely, I guess, understand and appreciate my faith, especially when I was an undergraduate. Because the way people like Lewis, and in my case also G.K. Chesterton,
Yes,
help
yes.
me understand and then reflect on the faith in a manner that's not strictly dogmatic, that was not strictly all about proposition, but more existential, more personal. Therefore, somehow I was more attracted to the faith, and that was, I think, I considered that part of my life, I guess, a stepping stone toward where I am now in my understanding of my faith.
That's a very helpful point, because both Lewis and Chesterton were writers who felt it was very, very important to use ordinary language to convey the realities of faith. And I think that they help all of us to do that, because the theological language sometimes doesn't work with ordinary people. But Lewis and Chesterton speak ordinary language, and we can learn from them as we try to do the same.
So I think we are about to end. So are there other questions that you'd like to ask, brothers? Brother Jerry?
Maybe a last question, Professor.
Okay.
We have said, Brother Maki has said about using questions that are not strictly dogmatic. He has appreciated the writings of Lewis and Chesterton. So in this world, which is kind of hostile towards faith in general, especially something as institutionalized as Christianity. So, what is the best way of approaching theology in this a society of which is hostile to religion and faith?
I think that's a very good question. Let me give you two answers. One of them is that people are suspicious of faith. Why do you believe something you can't prove to be right? And what we need to say to people who ask that question is, look, all of life's big questions lie beyond proof. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or a Christian or whatever. If you say the meaning of life is this, that's a statement of faith because you can't prove it. I think what you need to do is make the point that actually Christians are just being very honest and saying, here is what we believe. Some people are saying, no, we can prove our beliefs, but actually when you begin to press them, they won't be able to prove them. That's one of the problems Richard Dawkins had when he realized he could not prove his atheism was right. That's a very important point. Everyone is in the same position. If something is really worth believing, you can't prove it's right. That's a very important point. And secondly, you're right to express concern about institutions. Many people are suspicious of institutions because they feel they are concerned with power, they can become corrupt. And that's one of the reasons why we need to rediscover the importance of believing individuals. In other words, people like you, people like me, who can simply say, look, here's what I think, here's the way I see it, and try to make the point that this is me trying to explain the difference my faith has made to me, and that I speak as a person here, not necessarily as an institution. Obviously, we have an institution that we try to represent, but it is me articulating my personal faith. And again, that's important because people then find it easier to talk to about how you understand your faith, how you present it, the difference it makes to you. And with institutions, sometimes it's difficult to do that. That's why individuals are so important in answering people's questions.
Okay, and maybe I will ask you, Professor, to give your message to theology students, especially here in the Philippines. What is your message for us?
Well, my message to theology students in the Philippines is that you have been entrusted with a great treasure, namely the Christian faith, and a great responsibility to be able to pastor, to be able to teach, to be able to encourage your people. What I want to say to you is that when theology is rightly understood, it will help you do that job better. And I want to encourage each of you to see yourself as the person who interprets and applies the Christian faith to the people you are looking after. In other words, you can be the person who helps them discover the Christian faith in all its depths, in all its riches. And so you have a very important role, and I wish you God's richest blessings in whatever you do in the future.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Alister McGrath. Thank you for joining us for this interview. Maraming salamat.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.